Let's chat first to Dr. Duncan Robertson, who's Senior Lecturer in Management Sciences at Loughborough University, Loughborough Business School. He's also a member of the Independent SAGE Committee, which you'll remember was formed during the COVID pandemic to provide scientific advice to the government and the public. Good evening to you, Dr. Robertson.
Good evening.
Thanks so much for joining me. So what did you make overall of the evidence this week as someone who was studying the science at the time and now hears what was happening behind the scenes in terms of the politics and the civil service?
Well, I think it's there's a lot of chaos, it seems, at the time. And I think it's quite interesting to see how the organisation of government behaved in that time. And I think not very well. I think one thing we have to remember, though, is the evidence that's gone to the inquiry, unless it's kind of contemporaneous evidence in terms of, unless people have got actual documents, a lot of it is in terms of what people remember, and some people's memories are better than others. And I think we're seeing certain WhatsApps being used in evidence, but it was interesting that Helen McNamara said that some of her WhatsApps weren't available as evidence. So we're seeing partial take years until we actually find out what was actually going on.
Yeah, she said that her phone had been wiped, unfortunately, because she'd left the Cabinet Office during the pandemic. Do you think among all the swearing and all of the kind of headlines around that, we've actually learned anything about the policy failures? Has anything useful come out of the evidence other than that everyone was at war with each other, it seems, in number 10?
Well, I think, there were definitely failures. And I think we have to think about what we're trying to do, or what, the government, what the people are trying to do with the public inquiry. It's really trying to find lessons. But I think more importantly it's trying to make sure that these mistakes can't happen again. And I think the slight problem that we have at the moment is what happens if a new novel pandemic breaks out. Are we actually going to be making those same mistakes again? And as I say, if the evidence is going to go until 2026, what's happening now to prevent that happening? So I think, it did seem as though the government was focused around communications and getting the right messages out, which of course is very important in the pandemic. But I think, it was interesting, again, that Helen McNamara gave about how decisions were made, the kind of diversity, but not in the kind of traditional sense, but in terms of different people with different experiences deciding. And it did seem as though there was a little bit of a kind of clique making all these decisions, and obviously the decisions that weren't made weren't optimal.
Yeah, I love that anecdote that she gave where she talked about, I thought it was fascinating, she talked about the football and they were talking about transmission at football matches, and she was saying, on the one hand you could argue it's an open air event, the transmission rate is in theory low, but on the other hand the people in number 10 had never been to a football match, so they didn't understand that what you do is you go to the pub before the match or after the match, and that's where a lot of the transmission happens, or you're on the train or whatever, in a car, sharing the car with other people on the way to the football. So it was really interesting from that perspective, as you say, diversity coming into the debate, and whether people in number 10 really understand how the rest of the public live their lives. The other thing that really stood out for me as well, Dr. Robertson, was older people and the way they were perceived in number 10, because we know they were particularly vulnerable to the virus. A couple of quotes here that I wrote down. Older people should accept their fate. COVID is nature's way of dealing with the old. The accusation being that they were prevailing views in number 10 that Boris Johnson held. I mean, that is an extraordinary revelation, isn't it, in terms of the fact that they were essentially, on the face of it, willing to make choices that sacrificed the old.
Well, I think this goes to the heart of the matter that, what we had, several years ago was a public health infrastructure which was designed, people knew about their local communities, public health officers knew the idiosyncrasies, if you like, of what their communities were, old people, young people, people from different backgrounds, and knew how to protect them. And I think what's unfortunate is that that local knowledge wasn't available to government because, it had been weakened over, as a political decision. So I think, all these sort of things, it was very much a sort of from my reading of the inquiry evidence, it was very much a command and control, centralise everything and kind of control information. And I think it's interesting, you mentioned the trolley in there I think that was what some people were calling the Prime Minister. It seems a very odd way of describing, the person who's meant to be in charge. Because, to me, if you have a shopping trolley, it's something you push around and control. And I'm not quite sure whether it should be that way around in a democratic society. So I think there are huge amounts of things to learn about how information was flowing to the Prime Minister and flowing from the Prime Minister, because that did seem to break down, and I think that was very unfortunate.
Also gives an insight perhaps into the way the advisors perceived their role. Was it Dominic Cummings' job to push the trolley? Shouldn't, like you say, maybe the role had been reversed. The Prime Minister tells his advisors to get on with their work and help him, to support him in what he believes is the right thing to do. Was it frustrating at all for you, as someone who cares about facts and evidence as an academic, to watch some of the policy play out? Because presumably you had your own opinions on what the right thing was to do, and then you see the politics coming into it and sometimes the wrong decision being made.
Well, I think, we always think about, I think it was Mrs. Thatcher talking about advisors advise and ministers decide. So, and I think once again, Helen McNamara made a very good point about this, following the science and saying really it was a bit of a cop-out. Because, the scientific advice was there. Ministers have to make the decisions that ultimately change the lives and livelihoods of people. And I think it's just unfortunate that there seem to be these layers of defence, if you like, around some of the key decision makers, which made it, I think the result wasn't as good as it could have been if the system had worked as it should have done.
Dr. Robertson, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really interesting to talk to you. That was Dr. Duncan Robertson there, who's a senior lecturer in management sciences at Loughborough Business School. He's also a member of Independent Sage.